Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. Today we're at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance for one of their celebrity lectures. Let's go see what Cindy has for us today.
Welcome everyone to the Western Museum of Flight. I'm Cindy Maka and I'm the director of the museum. Today's celebrity lecture is special in three very distinctive ways. First, we have the benefit of the thorough knowledge and insights of Mr. Chuck Lobb, historian in residence, who is going to share with us some of his thorough knowledge of the history of our airport and the community which has nurtured it. Secondly, our special team of museum members provided a historically accurate Lomita Flight Strip model, which is on display in the hangar across the way. I would like that team, please, to stand that created the display. Herc Smith, Mort Sogard, Dale Hoffman, and Chuck Lobb. So please take a look at it. Also, thanks to Olson Visuals, Tom Olson and Eddie Vreede. Eddie, you're here in the audience. Thank you so much for your great graphics support. And finally, as a special treat, our VIP speaker has generously donated the funds to bring in this P-38 Lightning of the type that gave Lomita Flight Strip its wartime commission. Thanks to Chuck Lobb. And the Warbird is flown in today by Jeff Harris of Allied Fighters. Now, I don't know if Joe Honesty or Tom Sims are here. Joe Honesty. Joe was a P-38 pilot. He served in Italy. Thank you, Joe. And now I will turn the podium over to our good friend, Chuck Lobb.
Thank you very much for coming out, especially on an extremely warm day like this. And also thanks, Jeff, for bringing his pride and joy in for us to enjoy. Let me start off, first of all, by explaining how in the world did I get into all this stuff. Well, I guess it was the Torrance Airfare Association. How many remember Torrance Airfares? Yeah, okay, few people. Nancy, in 1994, Nancy Clinton decided to celebrate World War II. That was the 50th anniversary of D-Day. And most of us knew the field was built during the war. And I began to dig a little bit, and much to my surprise, it was very difficult to find any history at all. There were a few residents, I remember, who said, oh, I remember seeing P-38s flying around. But that was about it. Fort MacArthur had nothing. LA Air Force Base had nothing. Finally, the historian at the LA Air Force Base, Harry Waldron, he said, why don't you call the Air Force Historical Research Agency, Maxwell Field, Alabama? So I did, and that phone call resulted in 5 rolls of microfilm, 1,800 frames per roll. Oh man, I had monthly squadron reports, I had candid photos, the only difficulty was it was on 16 millimeter, which is a little hard to find a place to enlarge it, but I found one. And that's what you're going to see today. It started with some slides, mostly taken from that, plus pilots that visited me, brought their scrapbooks. I don't mean to demean fighter pilots, believe me, I'm very proud of them. But the ones that came to my home with their scrapbooks, each one individually won World War II by himself. So I had to kind of corroborate. I couldn't put that in the book. So I'm going to throw things out today that aren't in the book. Share some of those anecdotes with you. What kind of plane is this? You're going to get questions, but they're going to start easy. But pay attention. P-38. It was initially contracted for by the Army Air Corps in early 1937. They put out a proposal, and 3 aircraft companies responded: Lockheed, Bell Aircraft, and Curtiss-Wright. And all 3 responded, and the Army Air Corps liked all 3 proposals. So all 3 companies ended up with production contracts. Lockheed was given the P-38. Bell was the P-39 Airacobra, and Curtiss was the P-40 Tomahawk. So all 3 of those planes had to meet the requirement of 400 miles per hour at 20,000 feet in level flight. Now this was back in the days of stick and string, so you can imagine how difficult that was. This plane was owned by a fella up in Oceana named Lefty Gardner. He has since passed away. His plane has been sold to, I understand, Red Bull, and they've cleaned all the white paint off and polished it, so it looks very much like the one outside right now. But Lefty was the closest one to us up there at Oceana near Pismo Beach. This was the prototype line at Lockheed. They had a prototype of 630-some planes, I believe, something like that. And this is the beginning of the line. And here's their test pilot, Milo Bertram, one of those prototypes, over Glendale. That's Glendale underneath him. A little bit different than the plane that's outside, mainly in the oil cooler. You look right underneath the engine here and compare it with the guy outside. He's a much later model. Now let's go way back. World War I. At the end of World War I, the American pilots coming out of the war were so enthused about flying, they ran around and bought up surplus aircraft. You could buy one of these for about $300. By the way, what kind of plane is this? Very good. This is the Curtiss Jenny JN4. LA County was largely open land. So for $300, you could go flying anywhere you liked, land anywhere you like. Most of these guys, if they landed wherever they liked, the farmer would run out and try to collect a landing fee, and of course they'd take off immediately. But that was the start of aviation in LA County. Now let's take a look at the South Bay. This is kind of interesting. This was the whole South Bay about 1938. Upper left, San Pedro, reasonably well developed. Upper right is Redondo Beach and the Hollywood Riviera. That was started about 1927. Lower left here is downtown Torrance. And you can see some of the landmarks today, like Pacific Coast Highway. That's pretty easy to see. Lomita Boulevard is here. Hawthorne Boulevard is here. Crenshaw, however, only comes to about this far at Sepulveda, and it stops. Of course, there's no airport yet. That will be ending up in this area. One thing I wanted to call your attention to are these oil tanks, which, by the way, are there today. One of the very few World War II structures that's still here today. What are we looking at here? Anybody want to guess? Downtown Torrance. This is oil wells all over the place. This is a little closer. This is El Prado. This is Torrance High School. There's the athletic field that Lou Zamperini set all his records. This is Columbia Steel. Now I think it's USS Steel, US Steel. And the white buildings over here, this is Union Tool that built the oil drilling equipment. And it's kind of interesting that here's Plaza del Amo, Carson Street going right by Torrance High School. You notice you get much past Torrance High and you're out in the boonies. That was wartime Torrance, probably 10,000, 12,000 population, all clustered around the old downtown. What are we looking at here? Hollywood Riviera, somebody. Very good guess. This is the Hollywood Riviera. It was conceived in about 1927 by Clifford Reed. He saw the need for a Riviera-type village for the big moguls in Hollywood. And so he built this. As you can see, it's mostly roads, not much else. And he struggled about until 1956 or so, hardly selling anything. It was really funny because after the war, returning GIs bought anything and everything. Well, the Huntington Land Development Company finally took this over, built houses, and of course they all instantly sold. So that's the Hollywood Riviera today. There was a big beach club down here in the lower left. If you look real hard, there are some artillery gun emplacements. There's one here, there's another one here. This was left over from Pearl Harbor days when we thought the invasion was going to land in California any time. What are we looking at here? Come on, we're going to have a quiz later, you guys. Redondo Beach, right? Exactly. Redondo Beach. Here's the old horseshoe pier right there. You can just see it. Now let's zoom in a little bit closer on the Torrance Airport location. Here's the oil wells, Lomita Boulevard, Pacific Coast Highway. You notice it's mostly agricultural in here. And in fact, it's dark colored because there are two streams, seasonal streams coming off the hill. I've got a better picture a little later. And it's at least during wintertime, it's irrigation. What do you suppose this racetrack thing is down here in the lower center? Oil was stored there, right on the ground. It was also stored here. It was also stored here. This has a wooden covering over it, but that's how oil was stored, way before the days of OSHA, you can bet. A little harder to see, but this is Pacific Coast Highway here. This one's kind of on its side. Here's the oil wells over here. Again, this is more commercial. There were two commercial farmers raising mostly alfalfa and lima beans. They had three oil wells. They had three water wells of about 550 feet to irrigate their crops. Finally, in about 1942, or late 41, I think it was, Congress passed a defense bill that allowed the construction of airfields and roads and things to the West Coast. And this is one of the airfields, one of about 64 that were built in California, one of over 100 in all the western states. It was divided in two pieces. One, the white boundary, is the 480 to 90 acres that was purchased from the Ben Weston Investment Company for about $380,000. The first thing that happened was all of that land, because it was agricultural, was about 5 feet below grade. So a contracting company with trucks began to haul dirt from behind where the Parasol restaurant used to be. It's Walgreens now. That there was a big hole there. They hauled dirt and filled up 490 acres by about 5 feet. Then, that was round the clock, by the way, and there's one or two guys that rode with those truck drivers that I've met. Then the Bureau of Public Roads built the runway, 5,000 feet, about 50 feet wide, one runway. Then they backed away, and the Army Corps of Engineers built everything else. The taxiways here, these little spoke-looking things are called hard stands. P-38s were parked at the ends of those, mainly because they learned their lesson in Pearl Harbor that you don't group all the planes in a group in the middle of the field. They're all spread out. There was a maintenance hangar down here in the lower right. Now you can see Pacific Coast Highway very easily, Newton Avenue here, of course the oil wells. They're still there today. There's the field in March 31st, 1943. Corps of Engineers turned it over to the 4th Air Force, the Los Angeles Fighter Wing. And the intent was to train fighter pilots. This is their last stop before being assigned overseas. Here's the runway, here's the oil wells. I always point out the oil wells because that orients me. There's one maintenance hangar down here in the lower left. One maintenance hangar about 130 feet long. We'll cover that in some detail. Down here is in the far lower left, are the administrative buildings, barracks, all that kind of mess hall, all that kind of thing. Pacific Coast Highway in the upper left. Walteria Lake, you can just barely see that. That was a seasonal lake. Now let's look at what things looked like in November 1944. Those are all the training fields built in California. The main ones, here's Lomita Landing Strip, it was called. Mines Field, that later became LAX. It wasn't a long time yet before LAX. Grand Central Air Terminal in Glendale, that was probably the hub of aerial commerce pre-war. In fact, when the war came, the Army immediately took it over. And that's where the new squadrons were formed, one of which came here, or several of which came here, actually. Gardner Field, there was a pilot here who flew there in BT-13s. Santa Maria, that's really where the squadrons here coalesced with their other partners and boarded the bus, or actually a train, all the way to the East Coast in about 5 days to then transport to England. Now we get the good plane identification. What's this one? PT-22, Ryan. This is the Ryan Recruit, PT-22, built by Ryan Aircraft in San Diego, the same outfit that built Lindbergh's plane in the late 20s. They were into a training mode during the war. They actually built 1,000 of these things, and they were located at Hemet, at Lindbergh Field in San Diego, and at Tucson. They trained about 14,000 pilots. The peak was 1,200 in the fall of 1943. That was Ryan's job. You know, I looked at that and I see this guy standing right by the propeller, and he's cranking this inertial starter. I mean, I wouldn't want to do that. The idea, he cranks that thing and it gets a big flywheel up to speed with a lot of inertia. Then he yanks the crank out, he gets out of the way, the pilot engages the flywheel with a motor and it's supposed to start. At least he gets 2-3 cranks out of the motor. If it doesn't work, the guy comes back with the crank and we do it again. That's the idea. I'm not quite sure why all that extra weight of the flywheel they had to haul up in the air, but anyway, that was Ryan's design. Let's look at a couple more. What's this one? The type of plane, what is this? It's the same one that you see down the field here. This is a Stearman, PT, primary trainer, PT-13. This is actually a PT-17, the engine is a little bigger. How old do you suppose the average age is of those guys standing there?
23.
Not bad. Good guesses. Actually, the average age of the pilot when he finished here and went to war, 19 years, 4 months. And you wonder, why so young? Well, what 19-year-old worries about his own mortality? Time he gets to be about 23 and he's got 40 missions under his belt, then it's different, see? He wonders when he's going to get his. How about this one? The BT-13. This is the basic trainer, BT-13, built by Vultee Aircraft and Downey. And Vultee, of course, later merged with Consolidated, and Vultee Consolidated became Convair. The fill in the plane is here on the base in a hangar down at the end. And this plane had controllable pitch prop, and it had a radio which kept the pilot a little more busy than the other planes. This was taken up in Gardner. That's why I pointed that out on the map. Finally, this one everybody knows, right? The AT-6, or T-6 Texan, made by North American. 16,000 of these were built, about 4,000 of them for the Navy. 550 horsepower engine, Pratt & Whitney engine, retractable gear. It's the first plane I ever flew in, the T-6. This is a harder one. What was this one? Hey, there's somebody way in the back. This is the Curtiss AT-9, called the Fledgling. It was used to train multi-engine pilots, of course. The first time I saw that, I said, that looks like a plane designed by Calvin of Calvin and Hobbes. Doesn't it? The engines are way too big. But the guys that flew it said, oh, no, it was great. Good plane. And most of the multi-engine work, of course, is safety stuff, like what do you do when one engine fails and that kind of thing. That's the AT-9, Curtiss AT-9. This picture was taken over the desert near Williams Field in Phoenix, Arizona. Finally, the bird that we've got outside here. Now let me cover that one a little bit. First of all, this plane is owned by a developer from Minneapolis named Bob Pond. He keeps it up there in the summer. He comes down to Palm Springs in the winter. Here's a model of the field designed, a plaster model designed by one of the first squadrons here. The oil tanks are right here. This is the Los Angeles River. In the far right is the coastline of Long Beach, Terminal Island, and so forth. This is probably what this would look like in from about 18,000 feet. Mainly to train pilots so they can see what they're looking at. All right, let's cover a couple of squadrons that were here. There were 4 here altogether. I'm just going to cut it down to 2. This is the 429th Fighter Squadron, part of the 474th Fighter Group. Their insignia was designed by Walt Disney, as you might imagine. The pilots didn't like this at all. Everybody else was getting a fierce, snarling-looking creature. Look what they got. Some little mouse scared out of his wits. But they accepted it, and that was the official logo of the 429th Fighter Squadron. Here's what it looks like to load ammunition into a P-38. 50 calibers. It could be loaded from either side. There were access hatches on both sides of the nose. Here's what the front of a P-38 looks like. 4 50 caliber machine guns, 1, 2, 3, 4, and a 20 millimeter cannon here. What's the difference? Anybody want to guess? Much larger ammunition, 20 millimeter versus... There you go. The biggest difference is a cannon shell explodes when it hits the target. It's not just a lump of lead. The pilots could select either machine guns or cannon or everything. This is a test firing of all of the weapons, and the pilots said they had so much power that they could knock a locomotive off the rails. And they did, and several times in France. What was interesting was one of the pilots here told me he didn't get much of a chance to fire these in training here in the Southland. The first time he really let it go like this was in combat. And he said it scared the bejeebers out of him because the plane kicks back. I mean, all of that recoil. And he lost his airspeed. Oh my gosh. He learned the hard way. The 429th Fighter Squadron was in the Tactical Air Force, the 9th Air Force. The 9th Air Force followed the advancing Army through Europe because they supported the frontline troops. One of their bases was in Belgium, and the pilots actually stayed with families. And here's a family in Belgium. One of the pilots stayed with. Note the young girl there. She's about 8 years old, I think. And here's a picture of her in a recent reunion. Same 8-year-old young, a little bit older now. Oh, this is my favorite story. This was Second Lieutenant George Paddock, and that's Miss Lorraine Mettler, 1925, 253rd Street in Lomita. The house is still there. What happened was a P-38 had crashed in a vacant lot next to the house. In fact, if you look way down at the bottom, here's the wall of the porch, and you see the front of it's been knocked off. It was that close. George was a squadron engineering officer, and he and a photographer went out to investigate the crash. While he was there, Lorraine came back from work at Shell Oil, and when she came up to her home and the two of them saw each other, they fell in love instantly. Instantly. The photographer saw it, and he put the two of them up on the porch, took this picture. They had never even met when this was taken. They had not said a word to each other. The two of them today, of course, they were married after the war at St. Margaret Mary's Catholic Church, which is just down the street from her home. They live today up in Covina. They had 4 kids, 9 grandkids, and 3 great-grandkids. Wow. So far. The 429th, by the way, went to Europe in early February of 44. And within a day, the next squadron came in. This is the 434th Fighter Squadron. This was their logo, designed by one of the aircraft mechanics. He had heard that the P-38 was called the fork-tailed devil by the Germans, so he designed a fork-tailed devil. And that is still the logo today of a training squadron in Texas. They've still preserved that logo. Here's some of the training going on here at Lomita Flight Strip. This is probably, if you look on the right, these are probably some kind of canisters for chemical warfare. Here's the barracks in the back, wooden, drafty, leaking, but that was the listed men's barracks. Here's two A students standing in the upper left here. These two pilots are clearly more interested in what's going on in the air. Something else here in the flight strip. The field was largely open. There was wildlife here. And the squadron armorer, who was this fella here, he found some 8-gauge shotguns and some jeeps, and they ran around the field and they found some jackrabbits, as you can see. And I looked at that and I said, man, 8-gauge shotguns and jeeps? That's meat hunting. That's not sport. But of course the idea was to train them on how to lead the target. You know, it wasn't pursuit anymore. You didn't come in behind the guy. You learned to lead him ahead, like a quarterback throwing a football to a receiver running across the field. I bet you don't know this fella. This was Lieutenant Robin Olds, very famous. He's the only World War II fighter pilot who also flew combat in Vietnam. He had 13 aerial kills in World War II. He had at least 5 more in Vietnam, so he was an ace in both wars. Total of 18 aerial victories. He's deceased now, but his daughter wrote a book. This is the book written by Christina Olds. It's called Fighter Pilot. It's mostly his memoirs that she's assembled with a writer, and they put this book together. It's tremendous. He's very outspoken. A lot of 4-letter words. But he was a true warrior. When he scored his 4th kill in Vietnam, he knew that one more meant that he'd be called back to Washington and promoted to general, and of course generals don't fly. At least they don't pilot. So he wouldn't declare his 5th victory. In fact, he forgot to even record his missions. I think the total was 100 missions you were supposed to record, and then you go home. He had 152. That was Robin Olds. Got his start right here at Lomita Flight Strip. March 7th, 1944. Remember, these young men were all soldiers. It was Army Air Corps. And so they all put on backpacks and steel helmets, the whole base, and they marched up into the Palos Verdes wilderness, and they encamped overnight in a grove of eucalyptus trees and came back down the next day. They learned how to live in tents, how to cook their own food, so forth and so on. Let me read this to you. This is right out of the 434th Squadron reports. Among the many groups which had turned their talents to singing, one could hear many colorful voices, some with thick tarnish of malt and hops. From the tearful cowboy ballads of Lieutenant Evans, one could easily choose some rung in the ladder of selections that suited his fancy, his pitch, or his memory of lyrics. The rhythm section was afforded by a quaint group of enlisted men who seemed to keep time by enclosing 2 primitive-looking bone cubes in their fists and shaking in a menacing manner high above their heads, seeming to listen intently to the quality of the rattle. Tech Sergeant Giziano seemed to be the best performer, for his companions paid as numerous amounts of money to rattle over and over again. This is, I mean, you can see why I loved their squadron report. I don't know who wrote this stuff, but it was great. And the whole report is written with that comical kind of flair. This is Fred Hayner, Sergeant Fred Hayner. He was called Hayner the Painter. He's doing a pastel artwork now on the wall of the Officers Club. And as you can imagine, the young man had a lot of talent. He did a lot of nose art, and after the war, he became a commercial artist. He lives in Troy, New York. He sent me a wealth of stuff that I'll try to share someday. And he's not around anymore. But boy, he had some talent. There's Robin Olds again, leaning against a Jeep. On your left is Van Anderson. He was the squadron engineering officer. If you look way in the back at the top, that's the control tower on the field. It was on top of a shed, right about the middle part of the runway. Okay, somebody usually asks, how did all these planes get to Europe? Well, that's how. They were put on top of usually an improvised carrier of some kind. There are P-38s here. I think there's P-47s up at this end. In 1942, about 60% of this shipping was going to the bottom. The German wolf packs, the submarines, were having a marked effect. But it took the better part of 42 before it took core of the wolf pack, and now these began to arrive in good shape. There's what one of those planes looked like at Watersham, England, in Suffolk County, east of London. I noticed a couple things. I don't know if you can see it well enough, but there's black and white stripes under the wing, just like the plane it flew in. That was markings for a D-Day. All Allied aircraft participating in D-Day had those black and white stripes. So the ground troops could tell who's a friend. Of course, the P-38s were used very much in D-Day because they were easy to identify, the unique shape. What's interesting was that, as far as I could tell, there was almost no resistance from the Germans in the air. It was all on the ground. So most of these planes supported the ground troops with strafing and so forth. That's a fact that I don't think hardly anybody knows. The Germans had no air force to speak of. Why? Because we had destroyed their refinery in Ploesti. They had no gasoline. Now let me introduce you to a few of the pilots. This is the Captain Frank Keller. He had the first combat experience. He was strafing an airfield in France. He strafed all of the fighters that he could find, and nothing happened until he hit a Ju-88 Junkers at the end, and that one exploded. That had some gas in it. And he flew through the explosion. It almost brought himself down. Badly nicked his propellers. Frank Keller, May 31st, 1944. That was the first action the squadron had seen. George Gleason, a young man from western Colorado, 12 aerial victories at the end of the war. But his claim to fame was the squadron landing record. When returning to Watersham, he'd come in at 10 feet high, buzz the runway, then pull up, and as he came back, would lower his gear and flaps and land. He held the squadron record 28 seconds. Nobody ever challenged that, but for good reason. The top ace of the squadron, Art Jeffries, he's one of the most mild-mannered fighter pilots I ever talked to. He lives in a suburb of St. Louis. He had 14 victories, one of which was a Messerschmitt Me-163, the rocket plane. A P-38 got credit for downing a rocket plane. I got this story from his wingman, Elmo Sears. We sat down at coffee one time, and I got to tell you this one. We got a little time left. Elmo said they were flying Jeffries was leading a whole flight, P-38s. He spotted this Me-163 down below, and he nosed right over and headed straight for it. Straight down. Of course, the 163 did too. The whole flight went with him. Straight down, and poor Elmo, his wingman, of course, has to stay with him. Elmo's seatbelt came loose, and he hit the top of the canopy. He's plastered up there against the top of the canopy. He's got one hand on the stick, and he's going straight down. And my gosh, what am I going to do? He finally got another hand on the throttle. He pulled the power back, slowed the plane enough so he could pull out, As he pulled out, of course, wham, he dropped back in the seat. He got his seatbelt back on. He got himself adjusted. And then he looked around, and everybody was gone. He was up there by himself. Well, now what? He went back to Watersham. When he landed, the whole flight was there. Jeffrey was there. Jeffries came out and just rode him up one side and down the other. You're my wingman. You never leave me out there by myself. But, I don't care what it was. So he got his ass chewed. Did Jeffries actually shoot down that 163? Well, likely is he didn't, but he got credit for it because there was an undercast at 3,000 feet. The 163 went right straight into it in a vertical dive, probably doing close to 600 knots. He isn't going to pull out. He can't make it from 3,000 feet at 600 knots. So Jeffries was given credit for the aerial kill. P-38 technically down to 163. Here's a number of the 4th 79th Fighter Group guys that were all came back from a mission over France. They had claimed 32 enemy aircraft destroyed between them. Let me just go over the list quickly. This is on the left, kneeling here is Colonel James Herron, commander of the 434th Fighter Squadron. Next to him is Hub Zemke, commander of the 479th Fighter Group. And Hub actually came over from P-47s in the 15th Air Force in Italy. He came over to England finally and flew P-38s. George Gleason, we talked about him with his landing record. Robert Sykes became a general. He stayed in the service, became a brigadier general. Up here on your left is Robert Pigg. He was escorting, in a P-51, he was escorting B-26s over France, and his engine went out. He bailed out, and when he came down, one of the B-26s hit him. So he lost his life. This is a fellow named Smith. He was also in the 436th. Robin Olds, we met him. Tom Olson. Tom was became a wholesale grocer at the end of the war. But these 8 guys shared the credit for 32 planes downed in one mission over France. Here's a plane coming back to Watersham. You notice anything wrong here? No gear and one engine. Yeah, this is very, I wouldn't say typical, but not unusual. Oh, this is a little hard to see, but can you make this out? This was a V-1 buzz bomb, very good. It was an unguided, pilotless aircraft built by the Germans. It flew a straight course, usually to London, and when it ran out of fuel, it would fall and explode on whatever was underneath. A pulse jet engine. In this case, the engine's still running and you know you're safe because it doesn't come down until the engine quits. But this was passing over Watersham late one evening. In fact, here's one that did come down near Watersham. That's the officers' quarters, the officers' club. The British really knew how to live in a nice red brick stuff like this. But the explosion knocked all of the glass out. It took quite a while to get it back again. Now let's look at the ladies during World War II. This is a typical Rosa the Riveter shot. This is P-38s being built in Lockheed. Quite frankly, I think this young lady was probably a secretary in the office because of her makeup, and I don't think Rosie wore that much makeup. But I'll give her credit. This is young lady I want to introduce you to is Iris Critchell. She lives today in Claremont. She's a professor emeritus of aeronautics from Harvey Mudd College. She was one of the WASPs, or Women Air Force Service Pilots, the civilians that ferried planes all over the United States. Well, actually, the women didn't fly around the world. They stayed in the States. The concern was if you fly into enemy territory and get caught, you're not in combat, you're not an officer, or you're not in a uniform, you'll be considered a spy. So they didn't send women that way. This was the young lady that was the head of the WASP squadron at Long Beach. This is where they were based, because most of the aircraft were built here in the Southland. North American, Lockheed, Vultee, and they were all here. Douglas. So these are the planes. They showed up at Long Beach, and these young ladies and about 1,700 other pilots flew these planes to their final destination. This was Barbara London. Her name in the war was Barbara Erickson. And she actually ran a business on Long Beach after the war. I talked to her. She's just a little bitty thing. She had over 400 hours of flying time before the war ever started, which is very unusual for women. This is an abandoned building south of old downtown Torrance. It was the Torrance Flight Glass Company. It was empty at the end of the war, and a young man who was the vice president of Douglas said, you know, I think I'm going to open an aircraft business. So he commandeered this building, swept out the glass, and opened business, the Doak Aircraft Company, D-O-A-K, that hardly anybody ever heard of, but it was right here in Torrance. Here's part of his day shift. There's the address up there, 2321 Abalone Avenue, Doak Aircraft Company at the top. I think all told, he probably employed close to 3,000 people. And this is what they built. Mostly it was fuselages for training aircraft out of molded plywood, because that would free up aluminum for the combat aircraft. You can see most of the workers here were female, of course. After the war, the mid-50s, Doak, when he had a contract with the U.S. Army, as a matter of fact, to build a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. And this is it, the Doak Model 16. In this shot, you can see the fans at the end of the wings are turned vertically, so the plane is taking off vertically. And here it is in flight with the fans turned horizontally. This was believed to have been the first runway takeoff of a VTOL aircraft right here in Torrance. That was February of 1956. That's kind of iffy, but that was way back. This plane, by the way, today is in the Army Transportation Museum in Fort Eustis, Virginia, if you want to have an urge to go back there and find it. All right, meanwhile, the war is chugging along, and it finally ended September of 45, and the War Assets Administration was formed to get rid of everything. Airplanes, trucks, tanks, real estate, everything. And here's what the field looked like at the very end of the war. You can't see it very well, but there's the runway, here's the taxiways, maintenance hangar, all this stuff. What are we going to do? Well, the first thing they discovered was who owned what. Turned out the state owned the runway, the Bureau of Public Roads. The rest of the field was owned by the Army Corps of Engineers. So how are we going to resolve that? Well, they finally did resolve it by 1946. By the end of 46, they ended up allowing the city of Torrance to use the field, mainly because the Civil Aeronautics Administration requested that all airports, if at all possible, be maintained as airports. Meanwhile, here's the runway over on the far right, the taxiway and so forth. You notice all these houses are springing up in the Walteria area. That was for the returning GIs. They built them as fast as they could go. They had no interior doors, no screens, but they were cheap. And boy, they all sold like crazy. Well, one other thing I might mention, in late 45, a lot of Japanese Americans were returning here from internment camps. But the old barracks and stuff were occupied by the Japanese. There were about 80 trailers brought in to also house families. And they were there till about July of 46. By then, most of them had found permanent homes somewhere. Here's the old maintenance hangar. This is kind of an interesting story in itself. A very ambitious young man named Roger Keeney had been driving by the field his whole wartime career, and the field is empty, there's no fences. He moved into the hangar and started a business. Called himself Acme Aircraft. And you can see he's doing all right. These planes sitting around here were all part of his business. Oh, here's the dedication ceremony, December 7th, 1946. Yes, they picked Pearl Harbor Day intentionally. And this is when the city of Torrance was officially given permission to use the field. They didn't own it, but they were given permission to use it. Lou Zamperini sitting right here with his wife Cynthia. This is Hugh Sherfy. He was the mayor of Torrance. Lou's older brother, Pete Zamperini, is over here. Here's Edmund Doak here with his head down, Doak Aircraft. Martha Walker, she's a Hollywood actress, was here. A lot of brass from Marchfield came out. What kind of plane is this sitting over on the right side? There you go. T6, see? I can't ask you that one on the quiz. Anyway, this was December 7th, 1946. Here's the maintenance hangar again. The eastern side was completely open because most of the prevailing wind was from the west. This was a Waco cabin biplane believed to have been owned by Wallace Beery, the comedian from Hollywood. That was his plane. Over here in the corner is the last remaining P-38 on the field. Roger told me a crew came in to dismantle it, put it on the truck, haul it off for scrap. He says, "Oh, can you give me the instruments?" "No." "Can you give me this?" "No, no, no." It had to go away. Finally, the crew broke for lunch, and Roger snuck in there and he drained the ethylene glycol coolant out of the engines, which is not, that has some value to it. So at least he made off with that. Otherwise, the plane went to scrap. There's Roger Keeney, Acme Aircraft, and his good friend, Bev Roberts. Roger, by the way, just at the end of last year, passed his 100th birthday. And he passed away very shortly thereafter. So he's not with us anymore. But he gave me a whole lot of nice pictures. He had five drawer file cabinets in his hangar down here. You could open any drawer, pull out a picture, and he'd give you the whole story. Marvelous guy. All right, the field is beginning to shape up a little. Here's the maintenance hangar. Here's the corner of Crenshaw and Pacific Coast Highway, right about here. The Foods Company was the first store built in the Rolling Hills Shopping Center. Am I ringing any bells? Okay. Yeah, Roger's doing a land office business. These are C-82 packets. He was putting a jet engine above the cabin on all those planes. Another view of about the same thing. This was PCH. Here's Roger's maintenance hangar. That hangar lasted until 1982, and it got so full of termites that the city finally said, "Sorry, it's got to go." So Roger called up a wrecking company from Tijuana. They came up and hauled and put some cables on the thing and just pulled it over. And it was all torn down and all the timbers hauled away in one day in 1982. One of Roger's designs, in fact, this plane is hanging in the ceiling over there in the museum. He called this Sierra Sioux pusher prop. He called it the world's slowest racer. But what's interesting is back here is where the Del Amo shopping center was built. You can see it was originally very little there. We can go through this next set of slides quickly. This is the growth of the field. Businesses are springing up. There's Benbow is there, Nagel Aircraft, several private businesses on the field. This is about 1972 when the field actually hit its prime. We had better than 400,000 movements that year, meaning takeoffs and landings. This was the flight line right out here in 1972. Aerobatic pilots, we had full air shows. This is Bob Herendeen, national and world aerobatic champ, and his Pitts S2 was based right here at the field. Robinson helicopter moved in 1973. He went through a series of smaller buildings before he got into this one. Today, Robinson has got an incredible set of statistics. Let me go through these. They have 130 dealers in 65 countries. This is Robinson Helicopter right down the way here. They are producing 12 aircraft a week. 10,000 have been delivered as of last November. 1,300 employees. They have 4 test pilots. who are putting about 4 hours average on each plane before it's shipped to the customer. They are busy, and they are hiring, as you can imagine, like crazy. He said he has 400 back orders for the R-66. That's the turbine-powered.
Don't they make more aircraft per year than any other manufacturer in the world?
They're tops in helicopters. Okay, one of the air shows, we had Collings Foundation come in with a B-24. Here's our tower. Here's the General Aviation Center. B-24 coming in. That was in honor of Lou Zamperini, who was a bombardier, of course, with a B-24. They also brought a B-17. Parked it here right in front of the tower. That's the field, more or less, what it looks like today. General Aviation Center, built in '92, right next door. Now comes the hard part. Okay, we've got a couple of things that were not in the book that I thought I'd share with you. There used to be a bookie joint down at the end of Madison here. At least we thought it was a bookie joint, because one of the pilots was eating a breakfast there one day, and a fire truck and a police car roared up, sirens screaming. They jumped up on the roof. Turned up, there's a guy up there trying to set fire to the roof. And it turned out he was from, well, I'll say mafia, but no, they were behind in their bookie payments. So he was sent there to burn the place down. Another one that's not in the book. Another one not in the book was the end of Pennsylvania in Lomita, the very southern end, was a bordello, the Paradise Club.
What year was that?
It's not there anymore. You're too late. They had a number of small little little cabins for the ladies of the evening to entertain the troops. That was the south end of Pennsylvania Avenue. Don't knock on any of the doors down there. Okay, I've got one more short movie. It's about 4 minutes. It'll show you P-38s actually in action here during the war. This movie was taken by pilots of the 55th Pursuit Squadron. They were here in June of '43. And look at the planes and enjoy them, but really odd is look at the view of Torrance and look at the view of the Palos Verdes Hill. That's Torrance in the background. Nothing but oil wells.
Hello there, fellas. This is Royal Fry. I was a member of the 20th Fighter Group when it went over to England in August of 1943. These shots that you're looking at now were shot at Lomita Airstrip in June of 1943. When the 55th Squadron went over there from Marchfield for a few weeks. It's now the Torrance Airport, I understand. Now, I'd like to point out a couple of things to you fellas before we get into this. First of all, I'm going to try to keep the chatter to a bare minimum. An awful lot of this material was shot. It was shot after I was shot down on 10 February of 1944, so I really can't explain the scenes. But I think you'll still enjoy them just as much. Now, some of the film that was used to make this video was not in too good of condition. Some of it has emulsion flaking off and one color reel. Looks like the dyes are beginning to fade. But as we used to say at the Air Force Museum, when it comes to something historical, a poor copy is better than no copy at all. Now, I could have cut out some of the scenes in this video, but I left them in because they were shot by fellows who were in the 20th Fighter Group, and so those fellows must have thought that they would be important to someone. Even the shot of the British bunny rabbit that you'll see later on. Now, in this film, which was shot by Doc Wiedemeyer, in a few moments you'll see Dr. Wiedemeyer, who died in the mid-1950s of a heart attack in Columbus, Ohio. And then you'll see Don McCauley waxing his car, and you'll see Hoot Baker. And these last two fellows didn't come back with us after the war. Then you'll see some formation shots of P-38s taken by Carl Jackson over the western United States before we went overseas. And then you'll see a bunch of shots of Kings Cliff. And notice the still shot of Kings Cliff that you'll see in a few moments. The control tower is just slightly left of center. And it ought to bring back some memories to you fellas.
Look at Palos Verdes. For you car buffs, what kind of car is that? No, they didn't make them in 44. I thought it was a 41 Buick, but that's me. If it didn't show, I've had a ball doing this history stuff. And I tell you, it made it very evident that these World War II vets that are popping off pretty fast have all got stories, and somehow get your kids, your grandkids, get his story rewritten or recorded some way. Write it down by hand, tape record it, do something. Don't let Grandpa get away without getting his stories done. Thank you.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Seniors Out and About here at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance. I'm Betty Wheaton. I'll see you next time.